Okay, should we get started? Bismillah, Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barak wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So we've been looking at hadith number 14 in the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi. Last week we spent a lot of time just on the initial part of the hadith and discussing what Islam as a religion mentions around the sanctity of life and the respect for human life, right? وَلَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, Allah says in the Quran. We looked at a lot of different narrations in hadith, but the overarching understanding that the preservation of life being one of the objectives of Sharia, the maqasid of Sharia, and thinking out how, as a foundational ethos, it's kind of the norm, and juxtaposing that to systems and ideologies that's just not the case, right? Like every single day, you wake up to recognitions of how people could fundamentally care less about human life and how they create stratified societies and don't find dignity in racial, ethnic, socioeconomic differences. You see, like every day, the realities of children being killed, people being starved, what we find in places like Sudan, the Congo, Yemen, what we see what's happening in Gaza, the West Bank, throughout Palestine. The understanding is that the universal ethic that is the sanctity of life, that Islam as a religion quite definitively upholds, it's very easy to see that that's not something that is upheld by many demographics and people. You know, and that was a big thing that we spent time on last week because it's a key part to our tradition. You're not supposed to only feel for people who share culture and class and creed. You feel for people because you feel for people, right? Does anybody remember when we talked about this? Just to kind of get us up to speed. We talked about Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiallahu an, who's the narrator of this hadith. He was the first one to recite Quran publicly. He read Surah Rahman in front of the Kaaba in Mecca in that first phase of public propagation in the second phase of prophethood. So the first couple of years were in secret. And then when the Prophet ﷺ gets command to invite people publicly, they got to invite people publicly. And Abdullah bin Mas'ud comes from a low-income background. He is somebody who is described as being dark-skinned. His students describe him as having braids in his hair. Like he's a black companion, do you know? And he's giving a lot of insight into what historical narrative is, but it reads very differently now when somebody who comes from marginalized demographics in a Meccan society is telling us also about hadith that the Prophet shares his teachings around honoring human life and is setting the norm to be the sanctity of human life, and that the particulars of when something could be carried out would only be on these few occasions. Does that make sense? So we want to start to distill this now a little bit more and understand how this aspect of Sharia is developed in our tradition. It's not in a vacuum. And the first time we looked at this hadith some weeks ago, we talked about some of this foundationally so that we could understand some basic blocks that this is built upon. And we're not just kind of speaking ad hoc or in a vacuum, but we start to be able to ascertain, well, how does a hadith like this not rile me up or make me feel as if I have to somehow defend religion? Because the everyday Muslim historically didn't find this to be in contrast to the preservation of life and everything else that we've discussed, because they understood how Sharia was built and how it was formulated and what it was derived from, to be able to contextualize and understand it at its meaning, not reductively, but in the broader sphere of things, that you need a Muslim state and a Muslim court, and you need like due process and witnesses and these kinds of things. And it's not arbitrarily that somebody just now enacts what would be analogous to capital punishment in our legal system. There's a lot more that goes into it than that. Do you know? So somebody can read the hadith. If we can read the Arabic, the English, just so we have the barakah of the hadith being read. And then we'll get into some particulars. And then from the coming weeks, we'll start to look at the three instances that are mentioned in the hadith a little bit more specifically as it relates to like etiquette and kind of other principles in our religion, character formation. But we want to delve a little bit more into the concept of the hudud and how it is that these are derived. So can somebody read the English, the Arabic, and you can read one or the other, if not both. We're looking at Hadith 14. Yeah, go ahead.
The prohibition of blood of a Muslim. On the authority of Abdullah bin Masud, may Allah be pleased with him, who said, the Messenger of Allah, peace be upon him, said, it is not permissible to spill the blood of a Muslim except in three instances: the married person who commits adultery, a life for a life, and the one who forsakes his religion and separates from the community.
Great. Can someone read the Arabic?
I can read Arabic.
Yeah, go ahead.
عن ابن مسعود رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يحل دم امرئ مسلم إلا بإحدى ثلاث: الثيب الزاني والنفس بالنفس والتارك لدينه والفارق للجماعة. رواه البخاري.
Great. So to frame our conversation, I think rather than it just being something that we engage in kind of front-facing lecture, I want to use an article as the basis of our discussion. So if you Google the words Yaqeen, Y-A-Q-E-E-N, so this is the Yaqeen Institute, and if you're comfortable adding the word adultery to that, and it shows up in your Google search history, we won't tell anybody that you're looking at weird things, don't worry. There's going to be an article that pops up. Yaqeen Institute is Sheikh Omar Suleiman's institute. A lot of you are probably familiar with it in some capacity or other. And so this first article that comes up, it's going to be called Stoning and Hand Cutting, Understanding the Hudud and the Sharia in Islam. Did people see that article? Great. We're going to read through it to be able to kind of create a frame to how it is that we understand a little bit more in detail, like the approach to what this hadith is kind of giving us insight on. Do you see what I mean? There's a beauty in our religion that it doesn't require a high level of literacy for access. The bar to entry in Islam is quite lower, but you want to still aspire to have literacy in your religion. So you're not making claims just in the frame of, I think, or I feel, or my grandmother said this, or, you know, my dad told me this. Not to like knock grandma or dad, right? But you have to know what the fundamental base of your religion is, and not just in terms of practice, right? But there's multiple dimensions. This is what hadith number 2, the hadith Jibra'il, is teaching us, that practice is just one element, ritual, what we call Islam. Iman is a second dimension, ihsan is a third dimension, time is what kind of engulfs both of these at a fourth dimensional level, and this is what gives us an entire religion that we practice. Do you see what I mean? But we want to delve into this so that we understand it a little bit more. I'm going to read through the just intro really quickly and get us to a place of where we want to start. And then I'm going to ask people to read. So be ready to read, right? Reading is good, do you know? And a lot of you don't read. Like, you want to read actual books. If a device that you have is also a source of mindlessness, then actually utilizing a text that you read from, that you can mark up and you can engage, you expand vocabulary, you deepen in your own ideas by reading other people's ideas, right? Islam as a civilization is rooted principally on the acquisition of knowledge. Like, it's a knowledge-based civilization, do you know? It's not an ignorance-based civilization, right? Would anybody say Jahiliyyah is like the normative state of a Muslim? No. Like, people leave from Jahiliyyah when Islam comes in. They don't run towards Jahiliyyah. So how can you acquire knowledge if you're not learning it? There's a lot of Muslims who don't know how to read or write, right? So we're not saying that reading is the only way, but it is a way. And likely most of us in this room have the capacity to read. And so we want to start deepening in it so that our acquisition of information is also not through accessibility of information in the form of sound bites and YouTube videos that are more about entertainment than education. Do you know? So like when you're struggling, you don't want to go to TikTok to learn an Islamic concept. Do you know what I mean? Even if it's something that goes in depth, how much can you acquire in a minute to 3 minutes of a sound bite, right? As much as like if you try to listen to something that was at a conference or something that was like not where you were seated in an audience, it's not going to always like hit well. Do you know? It's got to be sometimes a little bit more effort exerted in the learning process. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is written by Dr. Jonathan Brown, who is a professor at Georgetown University. His wife is a prominent Palestinian activist. Many of us probably know Leila Arian. He's one of like the fellows at the Yaqeen Institute. And you know, he's presenting on this concept of the hudud. And so, as he starts, often the only things people in the West associate with Islam are stoning and hand chopping. These images permeate our culture from the trailer of hits like Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, to straight-to-cable problem like Escape Human Cargo. Again, in the trailer, if you can't live by their rules, you might die by them. There is no better example of how our society has consistently and profoundly misunderstood Islam and its tradition of law, known as the Sharia. Stoning and hand chopping do feature in the Sharia, but their actual function can only be understood by stepping back and examining how the Sharia conceives of law overall. Only then can we make sense of its severest corporal and capital punishments, known as the hudud. And so the next section, if you scroll down, the idea of God's law. The Sharia is not a law code, printed and bound in volumes. It's the idea of God's law. Like other broad legal concepts like quote-unquote American law or quote-unquote international law, the Sharia is a unified whole that contains within it tremendous diversity. Just as American law manifests itself as drastically different traffic laws or zoning codes in different states or locales, so too has the Sharia's application varied greatly across the centuries while still remaining a coherent legal tradition. Meaning, in Sharia, there are elements of continuity and change. It doesn't have a reductive approach that says every single participant and practitioner of Islam is going to look exactly the same in every year, decade, century of Islam's existence. Just like today, if we went to different parts of the world, Islam exemplifies and necessitates culture in order to be and manifest. So Islam in Malaysia looks Malaysian. Islam in Turkey looks Turkish. Islam in China looks Chinese. Islam in Nigeria looks Nigerian. It doesn't all look exactly the same. There are elements of continuity, elements of change, and there's things that are going to also vary in the manifestation of it. And it still has a firm base as a legal tradition. The Sharia is drawn from 4 sources. The first 2 are believed by Muslims to revealed by God either directly or indirectly. 1, the revelation of the Quran, which itself, contrary to the claim of a prominent Trump supporter, contains relatively little legal material, meaning the crux of the Quran is not made up of verses that are do's and don'ts or rules. This is not a religion that is only rules. It has a robust theology, it has a deep spiritual tradition, it has a much needed system of universal ethics and values, and all of those things inform practice. Practice is a means to something. It's not an end. This is why it's a problem if you learn the words fard and haram before you learn who Allah is to you and how to celebrate the divine in your life. Somebody taught you to pray your sunnah prayers before they taught you whose sunnah you follow. Why wouldn't you get out of religion what it is that you're taking from it? Do you know? but there's a lot more that goes into it, and the Quran is not just a legal text. And two, the authoritative precedent of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, known as his Sunnah, often communicated in reports about the Prophet's words and deeds called Hadith. These two sources work in tandem. The Sunnah is the lens through which the Quran is read, explaining and adding to it, right? This is also like a legislative kind of foundation from the standpoint of Sunni Islam normatively. Do you know? You're going to have parallels that overlap in Shia Islam, right? But the crux of this paper is written from the standpoint of Sunni Islam as we're looking at a Sunni hadith, but the majority of this is going to have kind of parallels, right? So just kind of stick with the concepts fundamentally on how things have derivation. Does that make sense? It's not just somebody looked at a verse and was like, this is what I think it means. There's a lot more complexity that goes into it. The second two sources are the products of human effort to understand and channel the revelation of God through the Prophet, peace be upon him. That the third is the ways that the early Muslim community applied the Quran and Sunnah. And the fourth is the further extension of this tradition of legal reasoning by Muslim scholars in the centuries since. The human effort to mine these sources and construct concrete, applicable rules from the abstraction of the Sharia is known as fiqh. If Sharia is the idea and ideal of God's law, then fiqh is its earthly and thus its inevitably fallible and diverse manifestation. This is like the foundation of it, right? So Quran and Sunnah serve as two primary sources, and then he talks about four. We have typically mention of five, right? Like mechanisms of sources of law. You have ijtihad, right? The engagement by a mujtahid scholar of like doing struggle with the text, right? They're engaged in it to extrapolate meaning. You have qiyas, analogy, do you know? So how do I pray on an airplane, right? They didn't have airplanes back then. So there's analogy to analogous like sources. And then you have ijma, or like scholarly consensus on issues, right? So now we're gonna move into a little bit more relevance to this hadith. A great irony in the ubiquity of stoning and hand cutting in the popular imagination is that these punishments constitute a minuscule portion of the Sharia. The tradition of law in Islam is the Muslim effort to answer the question, what pleases God in any particular situation? Meaning when somebody tells you something is haram, at a theoretical level, their endeavor is not to make your life difficult or suffocating. They're trying, through these sources of extrapolating legal ruling, to determine what does Allah want from me the most. So they're not trying to be judgmental or harsh, but when the Quran says don't eat pork, and the faqih says that means don't eat pork, they're not trying to ruin your life by taking bacon away from you, right? They're just telling you Allah doesn't want you to eat pork. Allah doesn't want you to gossip. He doesn't want you to backbite. He doesn't want you to lie. He doesn't want you to cheat. He doesn't want you to commit zina. He wants you to eat this, dress this way. Like they're engaging in it with this question in mind. And it has to have that multidimensional understanding of what religion is, because then you get to places where if the starting and stopping point is only fiqh and do's and don'ts, then practice isn't answering this question, even though you're acting on rulings that we're seeking to understand this premise, like what does God want from us? Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? As such, unlike what we think of as law in modern states, the Sharia encompasses every sphere of human activity. Most of these areas would never see the inside of a courtroom in a Muslim state, let alone in the West. Though oddly, obscure points in Islamic law do sometimes come up in cases on freedom of religion. If we were to look at a typical comprehensive book of fiqh, well over a dozen volumes usually, we'd find that the core subjects of the Sharia are the forms of worship in Islam, including prayer and the rules of ritual purity needed to perform it, fasting, charity tithes, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and hunting and slaughter of animals, about 4 out of 12 volumes. Only then would we find recognizable areas of the law such as marriage, divorce, inheritance, contracts, property, liability, injuries, etc. Although they are seemingly the only thing most people know about the Sharia, in a typical book of fiqh, less than 2% of the book is devoted to the hudud crimes and their punishments. Meaning Islam is a lot bigger than sometimes what like systems of whiteness and anti-blackness want you to believe your religion to be. If you don't learn at a foundational level, part of systems that seek to internalize racisms are going to have you look at things that are very expansive in a narrow mode. Do you see? The two categories he's talking about here when you study Islamic law are the ibadat, like the modes of worship, and the mu'amalat, right? These are like the non-worship things. So he's talking about prayer, zakat, etc., and he talks about marriage, divorce. Do you know? And that's what fiqh books talk to you about. If you talk to a faqih, for the most part, they're going to tell you the most important parts of Islam are going to be juridical. That's what their training is. If you talk to somebody who's a theologian, he's going to talk to you about aqidah issues and creed, which is different from iman, faith. If you talk to somebody who is a master of spirituality, they might talk to you about like the heart and the inner self. Similarly, like you talk to people across disciplines, they're going to likely tell you like this is an important thing. The religion encompasses all of it. It requires each of these dimensions. We're going to get into particularly a little bit more about the aspect that is ritual and fiqh rooted, but that has to be understood through these other questions that are being asked, right? Like, what is pleasing to God? When you pray, you don't pray in a vacuum, you pray to God. And if I asked you who is God to you, most of you would say, like, I don't know. No one's ever asked me that question before. And then you get to a place when you're trying to understand like rulings relevant to God's revelation. How would you be able to even think about what's pleasing to God if you've never thought about who God is to you? Do you see what I mean? So we get into a place where we now start talking about criminal law in Islam in the West. And we'll start reading through that. What I'd like for us to do, just take a quick minute, turn to the persons next to you. What's sticking out so far? Like what's kind of resonating? What are things that are coming up? And then we'll come back and discuss. If you don't know the name of the person next to you, share some names. And then we'll talk it out a little bit and then move forward. But go ahead. Yeah, you should go do what you gotta do, man. Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair. Thank you for the drinks. Guys, so these two brothers are from a new cafe that opened on McDougal. It's called Bora Bora. They're the ones that brought us these drinks. If you didn't get one, if you want to grab one. Can you remind us your names, guys? Yeah, great. So if you go on McDougal, 95 McDougal, they have a new cafe. One of the owners of it is an alum of NYU also. And they're just getting going, so try to stop by and support them. When do you guys usually open?
8 to 1.
8 a.m. till 1 a.m.?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, you know, it's like really no reason why you couldn't go, right? But go and check it out. What kind of stuff do you have there?
Basically smoothies. We got coffee in the morning too. Croffles, fresh juice. Sweets, crepes, waffles, whatever you guys need, we have it.
Yeah.
The menu is there too.
Yeah, great. We'll take a look at it. Okay, Jazakallah khair.
Yeah,
Assalamu alaikum.
inshallah. Thank you very much.
Okay, if you guys want to continue discussing, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
Yeah, the preface to that was about, the times that you are able to take a life away, like you're not supposed to take another person's life away, unless it was, they mentioned like life for life, adultery, or something
Okay,
like
so what are some of the things we're taking away so far? What's coming up for people just in this kind of intro kind of part to Professor Jonathan Brown's article? What do we discuss? Maybe a few people. Yeah, go ahead.
We were just talking about how the Sharia is law is not like it's fixed, but in the sense it's like it's always like it's like a discussion, not just like it's etched in stone. I guess if that's the right interpretation.
Okay. Other thoughts?
So we were commenting about like how come the religion has different aspects and different based on the culture, and this I think this shouldn't be the case, but you can correct me. This shouldn't be the case because the simple understanding of the religion is that that's what you were saying was what God means to you. He's the creator and he gave all of us just to take care of each other and love each other and love him because we are the manifestation for God. He manifests through us as his own creations. So it was interesting that how come the religion will be different and also between cultures and between one mosque will be well, it's Egyptian mosque and this is the Pakistani mosque and it's different and there won't be that acceptance, but our religion is based on acceptance in the first place. So we were talking about
How do you feel about the idea? What would you say is the intention or motivation of an American legal system? Because the idea about Sharia as a system is to figure out what's pleasing to Allah. What's the point of an American legal system? Yeah.
I think theoretically it's justice, but actually
No, not theoretically. What is it really about?
criminalizing and
Who?
the poor.
Yeah, the poor. Who else? The disenfranchised, right? Black people. Do you know? That's what it was about. Do you know what I mean? They built out a system that was rooted in challenges around race and class. That's what they were endeavoring to do, right? We don't agree with it. It's a bad thing. It is a bad thing. You should think it's a bad thing. It's not a good thing. If you think it's a good thing, switch what you think, right? But in being able to understand, they were pretty successful at what they sought to do, right? That's what they were looking to build with an intention. And they achieve that in various modes. Do you see what I mean? You try to juxtapose this to other systems of governance and try to just ask this question, like, how is what they're doing fulfilling an intention? What is the purpose behind this system of law? When was the last time you ever thought about your Islam as something that's purpose was to figure out how to live in a way that's pleasing to God? Do you see? I think about my Islam on holidays, at weddings, at funerals. I think about my Islam when I'm trying to tell my kid why I don't disagree or agree rather with what they do. So I'm just telling them God hates them because of what they're doing and throw the word haram a bunch of times, right? But Islam on a whole is about God, and it's about living a God-centric worldview. And a lot of us don't think about Islam that way, and we don't think about Islamic law that way because the legal systems we're exposed to, beyond the theoretical of lip service to justice and diversity and whatever, they don't care. They don't care. They don't care that there's tons of black people getting funneled into the prison systems, and they corporatize it on purpose. They don't care, right? That's why the idea that the general understanding of an ethic around human life in our religion is that all human life is sacred, it's sanctified. You can't understand this article and this hadith without that. And that's why we spent like 2 hours talking about it last week. Do you know what I mean? And you want to, as best as you can, separate the lived experience of how you understand the implementation of law and legal rulings and penal codes that are, I go through a red light, I'm gonna get a ticket, or somebody's gonna harass me because of my skin color or the way that I look, but not ever bother anybody else in those ways, right? So when you ask like questions, how did the white kid that shot up people get arrested with no harm, and the black kid that was playing with a toy got shot multiple times? Well, because one is black and one is white. And we just talked about what the purpose was of the system that they built. It wasn't about pleasing the divine, it was about retaining power and privilege. Do you see? You can't think about Islam at its foundation or Islamic law through what you've been socialized with in these other legal systems. And that's going to be an important distinction to make because it's going to be hard to mute some of that in relation to like what our system is in a system that exists contrary to it. We literally spent last week talking for 2 hours about وَلَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي Adam, right? But the legal systems we're situated in, they are rooted in anti-blackness. The entire foundation of the country gave full rights to white men. Women were given nothing, and black people were considered like half of a person and less, not even a full human in comparison to their white counterparts. That's the foundation here. The foundation in our religion is about what is pleasing to Allah, not how do I ensure the supremacy of my whiteness. Do you get what I mean? And understanding it with not lived experience, but an assumption that is what it is, and this is what they're saying. Does that make sense? Okay, so if we go into the criminal law in Islam in the West passage, I don't know if we'll read through this whole article today, and I read a part of this on the first day we talked about this hadith. We can reread it, but let's just start reading through it. Can someone start reading in order to understand Islamic criminal law? Yeah, go ahead.
In order to understand Islamic criminal law, we have to make sure we understand what we mean by criminal law in the first place. Most areas of law in the US, Europe, and elsewhere are civil law, meaning they deal with people's rights over law in the everywhere is civil law, meaning they deal with people's rights over an obligation to each other. These include contracts, marriage, property, etc. The government might play a role in adjudicating disputes in these areas through the infrastructure of courts, but these are disputes between private parties over wrongs they do each other. Crimes about wrongs done to the public, society, or state as a whole, and in most modern states, it is the government that acts to bring people who committed them to justice. Of course, wrongs to individuals and wrongs to society can coincide. In old, like very old, English law, if a man murdered another man in the street, then two wrongs have been done. The murderer had wronged the victim's family by killing him, and he had also wronged the king by violating his peace or the overall order of his realm, hence our term disturbing the peace.
Great. So let's take a pause. This is going to come up in the way that we understand how Islam functions societally. Because there is a distinction made between like private and public spheres of existence. This hadith that we're going to talk about over the next few weeks, the person who is in the first category, that is committing zina as a married individual, being unfaithful, is also requiring 4 witnesses to the act of actual penetration, right? It's not to be grotesque. That's what it is understood to be. That means that it's being done in some kind of public setting. So the challenge that comes in some of these situations is distinguishing between the private and the public sphere. This is what he's saying. This is a notion that exists comparably in other systems as well. The guy murdered someone on the street, and there's 2 wrongs that are being done: the act of murder and the disturbing of the peace. You can continue, go ahead.
The murder was answerable to both aggrieved parties. Centuries and many, many legal turns later, we find O.J. Simpson on trial for 2 wrongs. One civil, for wrongful death and the damages this caused the victim's family, and one criminal, murder, for which he was prosecuted by the state. As we all recall, O.J. was found innocent in his criminal trial but liable, i.e. guilty, in his civil trial. How could this be if the 2 trials were, in effect, for the same act? Did he commit murder or not? The 2 trials produced 2 different results because of different standards for meeting the burden of proof. In civil cases in the U.S., the jury only has to conclude that the preponderance, preponderance, thank you. The preponderance of evidence indicates that the person is guilty, i.e. over 50% likelihood, which in criminal trial the jury must be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. There are different burdens of proof because of the differences in punishment for civil and criminal wrongs. Civil wrongs are punished by compensation. Criminal wrongs are punishable by incarceration or corporal or even capital punishment. In the West, the notion that judges or juries should exercise extra caution in finding someone guilty of a crime comes from the canon law, the law of the Catholic Church in the 12th and 13th centuries, as to the notion of innocent until proven guilty.
So they're setting different standards in the systems of law that we are exposed to because the consequences of those are also things that have distinctions. If I have to pay $1,000 in damages to somebody, that's different, they're saying here, right, just for us to kind of extrapolate from it, than if the consequence is I'm going to live behind bars the rest of my life. Or I might have to face like execution and capital punishment as a result of the crimes that I committed. So the evidences that are necessary in order for those things to be enacted are going to be varied also, right? The hudud are going to be something that also have a very narrow capacity of being able to prove through accounts of witnessing in some of these instances. Like when we talk about adultery, like it's got to be witnessed by 4 people. Confessions are something that can be given validity. And if you remember 2 weeks ago, we talked about the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he mentions to err in mercy is better than to err in the conviction, right? And there's going to be a basis to that, but you want to just start thinking about, like through the example of what we're exposed to, how we can understand in terms of what we're going to be like thinking and learning about from a system that does not surround us, right? Like New York City is not a Muslim city, is it? You know, we don't live in a Muslim state. Do you know what I mean? We're sitting in a prayer room, but you're not in like an Islamic state, do you know? Here, we're praying, alhamdulillah, but we're not like governing things in that way. So we're not exposed to it. And one of the learning tools we want to think out is how we can take comparable understandings of what we've already been exposed to give us an insight into something that we're trying to familiarize ourselves with. Do you see what I mean? Do you want to keep reading? Yeah.
The Sharia has remarkably similar features. Actually, I think that Western canon law was influenced as a great deal by Islamic law, just as Western philosophy and science were profoundly shaped by Muslim scholars in those fields from the 10th to the 13th century. But that's another issue. Muslim jurists didn't categorize law into civil and criminal law, but these labels are nonetheless useful in trying to understand the hudud. The categories that Muslim jurists used were those of violations of the right of God, Allah, as opposed to violations of the rights of God's servants, i.e. human beings, al-ibad. The rights of human beings include the rights of physical inviolability. In other words, one can't be killed or harmed without just cause. The right to dignity, the right to property, and the right to family, and the right to religion. Just as in modern human rights, these rights are not absolute. They can be infringed upon with just cause, but they belong to all human beings, regardless of whether they are Muslims or not. If someone breaks your toe, smashes into your car, or reneges on a contract they made with you, they owe you compensation because they have violated your rights. They owe this even if they didn't intend any of these actions, since the damage was done and they were the cause. The same applies in American civil law. In both Islamic and American law, an exception would be if you smash someone's car because someone else threw you into it, which was out of your control. Along the same lines, according to the rights of human beings in the Sharia, if someone steals your phone from you, they owe you either the return of your phone or its replacement value. If someone kills your family member accidentally, then your family is owed the compensation value as specified in the Quran and in the Sunnah. In such cases, as taught by the Prophet, peace be upon him, the job of the judge is to ensure that all those with rights receive them. Violation of the rights of God in the Sharia are an important counterpart to the crimes in the Western legal tradition. Of course, the ultimate right of God upon mankind, as exemplified by the Prophet, is for God to be worshipped without partner, and this right extends to other acts of worship as well, like giving the zakat charity. But, unlike human beings, God is eminently beyond the capacity of any creature to harm. Also, unlike human beings, God has ordained upon himself mercy, and promised that his mercy encompasses all things. This element of God's vast mercy plays a crucial role in the other rights of God that Muslim jurists have identified, namely the crimes known as the hudud.
Great. So the idea is like what you're doing is a transgression against God. It doesn't actually have capacity to hurt God. Do you know? The way, like, if, I threw my phone at somebody's face, like, it would hurt in your face, right? Like, do you see what I mean? Like, there's an actual kind of consequence that you would feel this pain. Do you see? Right? So the idea here, as we start to distill now, what are the hudud, like, and why are they kind of enacted in this way, requires us to understand foundationally again, like, who is God and what's actually taking place here, that the recompense and restitution is not because you've somehow taken away from Allah, because how can you take away from Allah? Do you know? But the mechanisms through which we understand the implementation of this is not just about like, oh man, I'm the only weird kid that goes to this school where everybody's different from me, and my parents want me to not eat when the sun is up for a month, right? That's not like what religion is trivialized to. Do you see? There's so much more that goes into it, and understanding, as he introduces here, the maqasid sharia, right? The preservation of religion, the preservation of life, the preservation of intellect, the preservation of property, the preservation of lineage, right? These are fundamental rights that every human being has, whether they are Muslim or not. There are social contracts that we engage in, that a theology that is rooted in وَلَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي Adam gives a sense of dignity to all of humanity to have certain things. The carve out to this being understood has to be understood as a carve out within particulars and not as what is the generalized implementation of things. And that's why when we read a couple of weeks ago, 5 centuries pass in Ottomanist experience in an Ottoman Empire, and there's one recorded instance of a had punishment being carried out in 500 years. And it becomes like, for some of us, especially if you're my age or a little younger or older, like the normative narrative imposed upon us by Orientalists, people in the aftermath of September 11th that are looking to validate treatments and otherization, that they say, well, this is just what these guys do, and this is what their religion is rooted in and based upon. Do you know? 2% of a fiqh book, and fiqh being one science out of many sciences, and practice and ritual being one dimension out of multiple dimensions in Islam, like who's teaching you your religion? And how do you buy into it at the level that you're buying into it at? Do you know? So now he's going to define what the hudud actually are. Does anybody else want to read? You're doing great, by the way. MashaAllah. It was amazing. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
The concept of hudud in Islamic criminal law is not found in the Quran, though it is referred to in hadiths considered authentic by Muslims. Hudud in Arabic is the plural of had, meaning limit or boundary. The Quran mentions the limits of God several times, warning Muslims of the sin of transgressing them and that they should not even approach them. The Quran, chapter 2, ayah 187. But nowhere does the phrase appear in the clearer context of labeling certain crimes. Do you want me to read all of it?
No, it's okay.
As the famous scholar Ibn Taymiyyah noted, definitions for the categories of crimes and their corresponding punishments in Islamic law were the products of human reason and not scripture. Early Muslim jurists probably inherited the concept of the category of crimes called hudud from references to it made by the Prophet ﷺ and the early generations of Muslims. Muslim scholars have agreed that the hudud include adultery/fornication, zina, consuming intoxicants, shurb al-khamr, accusing someone of fornication, I don't know how to pronounce that, qadr, some types of theft.
You can just read the English, it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
And armed robbery or banditry. Muslim schools of law have disagreed on whether 3 other crimes should be included as well: public apostasy, sodomy, and assassination/premeditated murder for purposes of robbery. What is in common among the hudud crimes is that their punishments are specified in the Quran or Sunnah, and that they are considered to be violations of the rights of God. Of course, some of the hudud are also violations of the rights of humans as well. So you've got the hudud level of theft, sexual slander, armed robbery, and banditry are obviously violations of people's rights to life, property, and or dignity. The scriptural commandments that specify these hudud punishments are in summary. Let me keep going.
Well, let's take a pause, right? So it's going to be important to understand that there's particular acts that are now given this consideration, and the consequences to these acts are also then outlined through narrations from the Prophet ﷺ, understandings again of answering well, what would be most pleasing to God, but their implementation is not just kind of at a whim, right? There's going to be due process. So you're understanding the foundation. You need to know what the hudud are before you can think about how, when, and where they're enacted. Do you see? And having an overarching understanding of the concept can then give us a capacity to then think about well, why weren't they really enacted so much? Because some of these things, like even in terms of modernity, we would say like these are not like things that people should be doing. Robbery is bad, do you know? Premeditated murder in order to rob someone is bad. What's interesting is that as much as like adultery is considered to be one of the major things that we should not be doing, the accusation of this, and when we talk about the first group that's mentioned in the hadith about the married person who like engages in infidelity, right? Like being somebody who is liable for a had punishment in an Islamic state, like in Surah An-Nur, you also are liable for like like it's problematic that you accuse someone unjustly. Do you know? Like if you're making public accusations and you are calling against people, this is like Hadith al-Ifk, if you know like the Hadith of slander, right? Abdullah ibn Ubay and the Munafiqeen, when the Prophet ﷺ is journeying, he would normally like take a wife with him, and they would carry them in a haud, right? Like so, companions were holding this apparatus, four at each like position, holding on their shoulders. And Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha was with them. She separates from the group. We'll talk about it in more detail when we get to this in like a week or two. And we'll look at the hadith, right? But what was customary was the Prophet would leave someone behind to trail like a group of people in a caravan. So if anyone got separated, they'd have to walk back home alone. So there was a companion by the name of Safwan who was designated to do this, and he recognizes Aisha, who's separated from the group, and the companions don't know that they're not holding her because she's so light to begin with. And he comes upon her and recognizes her from before when the verses of hijab are revealed, and he just leads her back into the community. And then the munafiqeen start like accusing her through slanderous modes, do you know? And like you can't like, you can see how like it damages society if there's toleration of like this kind of behavior, right? Like what we engage in terms of like the shaming of a woman's dignity, anybody's dignity, but you know, in large part it happens to women, it doesn't happen to men, like the accusations of certain things, right? This is seen as like a major thing. You want to think about like, well, societally, if this is happening in the public arena, this is happening in places where like you walk down the street, do you know? And you don't want to think about it other than objectively. Like I went to Amsterdam for the first time when I was in like my 20s maybe. I don't know if any of you have been to Amsterdam before, right? Have you been to Amsterdam? Why are you laughing? What did you do in Amsterdam? Oh.
Because it reminds me of the dust chocolates in the airport.
That's what you're thinking about, Charlie? You're such a better person than I am. So I was in Amsterdam with my family, and it was Jummah, and I was wearing a thobe and a turban walking around, and it was late at night. It was our first time there, and we were trying to find food, and we couldn't find anything, and we couldn't speak a lot of the local language. Amsterdam's got like a crazy amount of weed. If you think there's a lot of marijuana in Washington Square Park, you have not seen what Amsterdam is like. But also, as I'm walking around, there's like literally people who are in the street, like enticing people to engage in a sexual relationship with them. And I am not saying like dress is a deterrent, right? And it's foolish when people say things like that, do you know? Well, maybe if someone was dressed more appropriately, they wouldn't have been assaulted, this or that. That's a dumb thing to say. Don't say dumb things, right? The Prophet said, La yajhal, don't be ignorant. That's a stupid thing to say, do you know? I've been to Mecca year on year, and we take like people in Tawaf, and if we're in the Mataf area, we have the men circle the women, because very unfortunate, but a reality, people in Ihram, as they're making Tawaf, they consistently will try to like grope and do things that they're not supposed to be doing, let alone like you're doing that in the state, right? And who are the people that they're doing it to? They're also women wearing ihram. Do you see what I mean? So you don't want to like make inane comments that don't make sense. Do you see? Right? But as we're walking in the streets of Amsterdam, like this is just happening in the streets. Do you know? And this is hadith that are about the end of times, that this is one of the things that'll happen. You don't have to think about it judgmentally, just objectively, right? I have a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old. Do you know? You might have like young children in your life, you yourself. If you walk through Washington Square Park and somebody was murdering someone in the street, wouldn't it have an impact on you? When you hear about like a school shooting, do you want to send your kids back to school? Do you know? When you think about the realities and revelations that we had, even in the Muslim community, of spiritual abuse. We talked about this at Jummah last Friday, right? With Sam Sharif, he engages in immoral conduct with a student and that student's daughter. Are you gonna wanna send your kid to study Quran with a Quran teacher? No, right? It has like impact behaviors. Do you get what I mean? And Islam as a religion doesn't come to weaponize religion and make you the like haram police that make everyone's life miserable. Like you walk up behind people while they're praying and pull on the sleeve of their shirt, because that's not what it is. But it creates accountability mechanisms and deterrences through the implementation of certain things, because your behavior will also impact the rest of us. Do you see? And it's not a private religion in that way that says, well, like, I could just do whatever I want to, who cares? And so these things, they are rooted in a sense of also like the impact on those involved, as well as consequently, like what it does to erode certain things within the public sphere and societally. Does that make sense? And even despite that, the deterrents are in place for a reason, and they're still encouraged, the fuqaha, like through this hadith, to err on the side of mercy is better, you know? Does that make sense? Okay. The scriptural commands that specify these hudud punishment are in summary zina, right? Like we went through some of these, and you can read through them. They're going to give you an insight as to what it is that the actual had punishment is, from lashing to a hand being cut off to these kinds of things. They're not unimportant, but in the interest of time, right? Like most of it we're not going to really retain, do you know? But like you can go back and read this section if that's something that bears interest to you as to what the actual punishment is related to this. In that last paragraph, the hudud do not cover what most legal systems would consider the most serious part of criminal law, murder, but this does fall within what we can term Islamic criminal law. Although the Quran and Sunnah conceptualize murder, accidental killing, as well as physical injuries done to others as private wrongs against individuals and their families from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it was the state that oversaw these disputes and carried out punishments. These were violations of the rights of people, but they also touched on the realm of public order and violence, which was the territory of the ruler. Since cases of homicide were brought by the victim's kin, much like in the West until the 19th century, the state in the person of the judge or governor would be responsible for bringing cases for victims with no kin on the basis of the Prophet ﷺ saying that the authority is the guardian of those who have no guardian. The state also often took responsibility for compensating victims and their families when the guilty party could not be identified. It's an entire different scope on governance. Like when you read stories of Umar ibn al-Khattab going through the streets and passing out food to people who are in need. And he gets to places where he sees a woman who is stirring a pot and feigning having food, and when he inquires what's happening, and she says, I don't have anything to eat, and my kids are crying, and I'm hoping that they'll just cry themselves to sleep and then not notice their hunger. And then he goes and he brings like stuff from the inventory he has access to them. And then she like takes it with gratitude and says like, you are better than like the Khalifa. And he says, why? Because she doesn't recognize him. And she says, Like he has a responsibility over us that he's not fulfilling, and you are fulfilling it, right? And in many instances, Umar cries and says, like, everyone is more knowledgeable than Umar. Everyone's better than Umar. But the idea of government is about like a servant-based leadership role. Do you know? Like you're supposed to actually take care of the needs of your people. That's like what the idea is, right? The sultan is the guardian of the one who has no guardian. Do you see what I mean? And like today, like the majority of people that live in cities and states are actually like worried about the treatment that they're gonna get consequently from the government or from, like, by extension, the government's watchdog. A bucket of power that people possess is if they are the ones that control law enforcement. They control military. Do you know what I mean? What can you do? Do you know? Do you believe, like, when these elections are happening, the people who are running, how many of them do you think are actually running in a way where, like, they fundamentally wake up and say, I'm going to try my best to take care of the people I serve today? And it goes back to, again, like, what is pleasing to Allah. Amr ibn al-As was a governor at the end of his life. And his son, Abdullah, hears him, like, kind of in tears. And he's worried about his father's state. Is he about to die and the angels of death are coming? And Amr ibn al-As, he says, I divide my life into 3 frames. There was a time when I was the staunchest enemy and opponent of the messenger of God, right? Like when they migrate from Mecca to Abyssinia, if you come to the Sirah class we do on Wednesdays, we talked about this like months ago, right? Of the people from Mecca who chase after that group to Abyssinia is Amr ibn al-As. And when they say, like, we should go back, we can't do anything, he says, no, I'm going to try again tomorrow. I'm going to do whatever I can to bring them back so we can make life hard for them. So he's saying state number 1 is when I was in that state. I was an enemy of the messenger of God. I was an enemy of Islam. State number 2, he says, is when he became Muslim. And he said, had I only just died in that state. State number 3, he says, where these tears come from, he's now a governor. Every person that has placement under my jurisdiction has the capacity to say, I did not fulfill their rights on the day of judgment. And these tears are in recognition that I will have a lot of accountability. People ask, like, well, what is it enjoyable? Like standing in front of 1,000 people every week giving a khutbah, going to conferences, doing this stuff? No, like each one of you will be able to tell Allah, he did or did not do right by us. It doesn't change the fact that I love each of you, but also if I really try to think about it in the prism of what this religion says, I can't fundamentally just pick and choose at a matter of comfort or convenience. I chose to take on certain roles. I have to fulfill what those roles are. You decided to be grown enough to have a kid, then you gotta be that kid's parent. You don't get to decide that it's too hard. Do you know? You chose to be a Quran teacher, you have to honor the rights of what that means. And when you don't, people get hurt and people have accountability back to you. Do you understand? The authority is the guardian of those who have no guardian. It's an entirely different paradigm. You can't think about it through a mode of governance that is what we're surrounded and situated today, that its foundation was the achievement of anti-blackness right from the beginning. Why would they then look out for the ones that no one has anyone to look out for? Do you know? Why do you keep going back to them for validation? Like, why is their acceptance so important to you? Do you get what I mean? Okay. God's mercy and applying the hudud punishments. Maybe we can read through this section and then we'll wrap up for today. Does anybody want to read violation of people's rights have to be restituted? My computer's going to die. Yeah, go ahead.
Violations of people's rights have to be restituted on the other hand, is not actually harmed by violations of his rights. In the case of the rights of God, it is God's mercy that defines Islamic legal procedure. Only an adult Muslim of sound mind and who is aware that one of the hudud acts has been prohibited by God and still intentionally engages in it is even theoretically liable for the punishment. In this regard, the hudud crimes differ from violations of the rights of people, such as accidental manslaughter or accidentally damaging people's property, where intention is not required, and children's families are liable for the damage they cause. The central principle.
So just to pause here, right? Like you don't carry a HUD punishment against a kid. If somebody doesn't have mental capacity, they have insanity, right? Like it's categorically different the way Sharia applies to people in certain situations. Does this make sense? Right? Go ahead.
The central principle in the application of the hudud punishment is maximizing mercy. This was formulated clearly in a hadith attributed to the Prophet ﷺ that was also echoed by common companions, among them his wife Aisha and the caliphs Umar and Ali. The best attested version states, ward off the hudud from the Muslims as much as you all can, and if you find a way out for the person, then let them go. For it is better for the authority to err in mercy than to err in punishment. Within a century of the Prophet's death, Muslim scholars had digested this hadith into the crucial legal principle of ward off the hudud by ambiguity, shubuhat. Some might argue that this doctrine was developed by Muslim jurists in the generation after the life of the Prophet ﷺ to remedy the Quran's harsh punishments. In other words, they inherited a regime of severe punishments, and maybe they thought they needed to find some way out of applying them. Or one might argue that the Prophet himself, ﷺ, preached warding off the hudud if at all possible, because he was uncomfortable with the punishments revealed in the Quran. But neither of these theories could be correct. The establishment of a harsh regime of punishments alongside a nearly unreachable standard of proof occurs together within the Quran itself. The Quran ordains that those who commit adultery should be lashed 100 times, but just one verse later it states that anyone who accuses someone of adultery without 4 witnesses to the act is punished with 80 lashes for slander. Why would a message seeking to establish an order of law set up harsh punishment, but then make them almost impossible to apply? We will discuss this later, but now let's turn to the ambiguities, shubuhat, that Muslim jurists elaborated to avoid applying the hudud.
Okay, so here, right, the shubahat, these are like things that term is brought up in a lot of different ways within like Muslim conversations. Do you know? But here, it's like a purposeful, like intentional mode to find it. Do you see what I mean? So that there's a reason as to why one wouldn't actually apply actively the HUD punishment, right? And so they're saying the jurists in relation to this narration in the prophetic tradition that Ali, Umar, and Aisha are related to have said are kind of the bases of how it is that they are going to now go in with a frame. Do you get what I mean? Right? Like in these underlying principles you have to think about, right? It's not about like the ego and the nafs and what I feel like should be done, right? There's basis to this. What's pleasing to God? The authority is the guardian of one who has no guardian, right? To err in mercy is better. Ward off like the hudud, do you know? They have these guiding frameworks that are a part of this process. Do you see what I mean? This is why like people say when you are talking to people about Islam, if you don't know what you're talking about, it's better not to say anything, right? And when you're like engaged with people, that they should have a basis at least in the arena of religion that they are discussing with you, because you can really mess up people if you don't know what you're talking about. And you make claims that are rooted in what exactly? Do you know? There's a hadith where a man has a wound on his head and his head is bandaged. And I'm going to be looking at my phone, not because I'm reading my text messages or anything. I don't reply to texts, as many of you know, in a timely manner. So we can all agree that I'm not doing that, right? Do you know? You know what I'm talking about? You're nodding your head. See, there you go, right? So I'm not being rude. I'm sorry that I rudely don't respond to texts. But like a lot of people have my cell phone number. But my laptop's about to die. And I want to just keep the article open, right? So this companion, he has a head wound and it's bandaged. And that night, he has a nocturnal emission. He has a wet dream. And he has to have a ghusl. There's a shower that you do once something like that happens. And so he asked people, like, what should he do? Does he remove the bandage and wash over this? Or can he just wipe over or have the water go over the bandage? And they say, no, like you got to wash over all of it. Do you know? And he removes the bandage, washes over it, the wound gets infected, and he dies. And the Prophet finds out, and the Prophet gets angry. He says, why did you tell him that he had to remove the bandage? It would have sufficed for him just to wipe over it, right? They know what they were talking about. Do you know what I mean? The whole idea about reading stuff like this isn't like, hey, I read this one article, half of it in a like Monday night halakha, you know, and now like I'm an expert on the had punishment. No, right? If anything, it's just about like, oh man, there's probably like a lot of stuff that I should probably just not comment on, but also I probably shouldn't take an understanding of my religion from people who are trying to get me to hate my religion. There's a lot more that goes into it than not. I don't know what happened, but Siri just turned on my phone and tried to find everything I just said. And so they're going to look for this, and these are like guiding like principles when they're exerting it, because it goes back to that first frame, what's going to be pleasing to God. The jurist has to do what's accountable to God, right? When people come and sit with me in my office, and they're like, can I do this or that, you know? It's like, no, like I'm not able to change like what is impermissible into permissible. Like I can't. That's not within my scope because there's an accountability. No one's trying to be judgmental of you. Like you can struggle with something, but if you try to turn something into something that it's not, like that's not going to really work, do you know? And what's beautiful is they're going back to a base that is from the words of the Prophet of God, right? Like here the Prophet is telling them this is what this is about. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? In this section where he is saying that some might argue that this doctrine was developed by Muslim jurists in order, in the generations after, you know, that section is to upend like people who want to cast doubt in your head that the foundations of this are somehow skewed. They're not doing this based off of like a sense of ethical conduct that kind of, you know, elevates itself at a later time, or they see something, like they're rooting it in what is foundational, right? They're finding like their movement forward based off of things that are authentic. The Prophet of God is the one that tells them to do this, right? And he is the manifestation of the Quran, like walking, talking. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Do you want to continue?
The Muslim jurists who developed the massive and diverse body of fiqh took the Prophet's command to ward off the hudud very seriously. Some of the procedural safeguards were found in the Quran itself, such as the requirement for 4 witnesses to zina. A significant number were added in the Hadith. In the most famous case, there are 6 known instances of the Prophet ﷺ ordering a man stoned for adultery. The man comes to the Prophet ﷺ and confesses his sin. The Prophet asks him if he is crazy, and when he continues to insist, the Prophet ﷺ suggests that perhaps he only kissed the woman. In order to prevent witnesses from assuming sex was occurring when perhaps the couple was just embracing or lying on top of one another, the Prophet ﷺ required the witnesses to testify that they'd seen his penis enter into her vagina like an eyeliner applier entering into its container. Because the man who confessed Ma'iz insisted on confessing 4 times to the Prophet ﷺ, the majority of Muslim scholars require all confessions of zina to be done 4 times. Anything less cannot be punished by the hudud.
So why is the Prophet telling this man who's saying, hey, I did this thing, and he's saying, no, maybe you didn't do it, right? Maybe all you did was kiss this lady. Do you know? Like why? Why is he doing that? But understand it in light of what we're reading, that the people who are doing this thereafter, they're using the base of the Prophet's interaction with people in this instance. But just like anybody else, the Prophet is now going to have to follow what it is that he's commanded to do. So when the confession comes 4 times, the man bears witness against himself 4 times, the prophet is stuck, right? It's going to come up, I think, in this article, but like you can take a confession back also. Do you know? Like that room is there to do that. Do you see what I mean? We can talk like in future sessions about why would somebody want to do this? Do you know? Like what would compel an individual to have a HUD carried out against them? There's a lot of different like bases to this, but we don't live in a place or a time where that can happen to you, nor can you carry it out against somebody or ask someone to carry it out against you, right? Like here, though, their understanding is potentially rooted in the idea that if I'm held in consequence for a transgression in this world, that alleviates me from being held in consequence for it in the world beyond this one. Do you see what I mean? And the realities of what the other world offers to them is more important than what it is that they might have in this world. Do you know? Allah knows best. And the particulars of it, right? Our religion is not a prude religion. We're not utilizing terms that we may or may not use callously in modern parlance in a way to denote anything that is vulgar. But the prophet of God is sharing this because specificity has to be key. If he alludes to it with ambiguity, then it's not going to be as difficult of a task as can be only through the illustration that he's offering in relation to the particulars of what you need to see happen in terms of a man's physical body and a woman's physical body and how it is that they are now engaged in this act in and of itself. Anything else does not constitute the requirement for this, right? That's like crazy hard. And it's built into what is necessary. You can keep going.
Based on the same case of Ma'iz, jurists agreed that even someone who had confessed to zina could retract that confession at any point and no longer face the hudud punishment. Finally, even external signs such as pregnancy were not considered proof that zina had occurred in the opinion of the majority of Muslim scholars. For example, if a woman's husband had been away for years, he could have been miraculously transported to be with her, or she could have been raped. The one school that did consider pregnancy determinative proof of zina, assuming the woman didn't claim she had been raped, allowed the possibility that a woman could be pregnant for up to 5 years. Normally in the Sharia, such miraculous or fantastic claims would carry no weight in legal matters, but as possible ambiguities to prevent application of the hudud, they were accepted. This immense allowance for ambiguities in ruling on sexual offenses can be seen most clearly in the Hanafi school of law, which was the official school of the Ottoman Empire. When prostitutes and their clients were caught, they were not tried for zina due to the admittedly outlandish ambiguity that prostitution was structurally similar to marriage. Both were exchanges of sexual access for money, in the case of marriage, the groom's dowry payment. This is not because Muslim scholars had any sympathy for prostitution or a low regard for marriage, but rather because they hunted for any possible ambiguity to avoid implementing the hudud. In the case of sariqa, the strictest definition of the crime laid out by the Sunnah explains why I've been so reluctant to translate it as theft. Sariqa is only a very specific kind of theft. First, Hadith specified that a thief would only have their hand cut off, stealing something over a certain value. In another Hadith, as well as in the practice of the companions, we are told that an accused thief should be prompted 2 or 3 times to deny that he stole. In court procedure, what this means is that even if the thief is caught red-handed, with the usual number of witnesses, 2, testifying that they saw him steal, all the thief has to do is claim that the item was his, and enough ambiguity would be established to make hand-cutting out of the question. On the basis of an instance in which a man stole a cloak from under a sleeping man's head, jurists concluded that only something stolen from a secure location, his, a concept determined by local custom and conditions, merited the hudud punishment. The Prophet ﷺ also exempted acts of misappropriation done blatantly in the open. In the end, the list of requirements that Muslim scholars agreed on to eliminate all ambiguities reaches over 3 pages. See Appendix Requirements for Amputation for Theft from As-Subki. As a result, as described by scholar Rudolf Peters, it is nearly impossible for a thief or fornicator to be sentenced unless he wishes to do so and confess.
Okay, right? Now I want you to think about a question, right? And we'll wrap up this. There's one more paragraph. Do you want to read the last paragraph in this section?
This system of making it virtually impossible to implement the hudud punishments through ambiguities characterize the hudud crimes of intoxication and to a lesser extent sexual slander as well. Someone who smells of alcohol would not be liable for the hudud punishment. Even someone who was seen drunk and vomiting up wine was not subject to the hudud punishment according to most Muslim jurists because he could have drunk the wine accidentally. Since Muslim scholars have disagreed a great deal about what constitutes an intoxicant, the approach to applying the hudud punishment has been to follow Imam Shafi'i's position that people are only punished based on certainty.
So, understanding this idea of the ambiguities in the implementation of this, but recognizing it principally as to why would they engage in this? Like, what are they doing? These people are also accountable. Like, if they kill someone or play a role in cutting off someone's hand or doing whatever, right? Like, that person is going to also stand on the day of judgment. Do you see what I mean? These are not like things that the sanctity of life is somehow undermined in some capacity, but we're in a place where we have to be able to recognize like the different aspects to what's happening here. What I'd like for you to talk out, just as we're kind of wrapping up, and we'll read through the rest of the article, why do you think like we're going through this article? Because I could approach this in a different way. I could have talked to you just about like zina and verses around zina and why you shouldn't commit zina and why infidelity is haram in Islam, right? Which it is. Do you know? You should not cheat on your spouse. It is wrong. And we could have gone in a conversation that's just in that mode, right? And we could have talked about it from the standpoint of character and infidelity and unfaithfulness and how this isn't like something our religion is built upon. And we will likely discuss some of these things in the coming weeks as it relates to the particulars of this hadith. But why do you think we're doing it this way? Like, why are we engaging in this reading? Why are we talking about the sanctity of life? Like, why are we spending that much time going through a framework through this article? Does the question make sense? Because you want to be able to think about why the approach is this way and not just like, well, you know, like zina is bad, right? And clearly, like having an affair when you're married is not a good thing. Do you see what I mean? And we can have that conversation. But why do you think we're doing it this way? If you can turn to the persons next to you and talk it out a bit, and then we'll come back and discuss, and we'll wrap up for today. But go ahead.
Who wants to go first? I'll start actually. So what comes to my mind is that our faith is not strictly based on just laws and like do's and don'ts. It's more of like you're still accountable for your actions regardless if no one keeps you accountable. Like God's mercy is the ultimate goal at the end of the day. No matter how you want to like frame your works or mind, you're still going to be accountable to God at some point. So the laws are just there to help you kind of build a framework, but it's not so absolute. Like how you use the example of the guy with the wound, and you wash yourself just for the sake of rules, and then he ended up dying. Right? So it's about understanding that you have to do things for the right cause, the right reason, and hold yourself accountable because not just are you facing mercy with God, but also like the people around you are affected by you, and God will look at that. You know, so that kind of that's how I took the most out of this conversation, like how to keep yourself accountable outside of just like looking at the do's and don'ts, you know. you said, it's like almost like the way I think of it, it's like if someone does commit adultery, right? Instead of just following the rules or the laws of what he did wrong, maybe they didn't know, right? And then you're allowed to teach them, and that's like the sign of mercy to God. The person's like, okay, you're done. You did something wrong. X you out. But like, what if you genuinely didn't know, or they are genuinely sorry, or whatever it is? Like, there's room for forgiveness, and that's where it's about being accountable to yourself, because you're the one gonna face it. Let's say you lie and say, I didn't know about it. I didn't know this was wrong, and then you actually lied about it, and maybe they did forgive you, but you're still gonna go face God later on and say, I fooled these people, and He's gonna know that. So that's why it's not just about the laws itself. It's also about everything is unique situation, especially like that. For me, the headband story took us. I have heard of that. Sorry. Yes, just like direct on, feedback on what you were talking about. Can I actually keep the link to the article? I'm kind of lost now. I can drop it to
Okay, what do we think? Like, why are we doing it this way? Yeah, go ahead.
I've honestly been thinking about like all the conversations of love that we've had for the past month and a half, where we're seeing a different framework of justice, one that is not punitive and accusatory, and one that doesn't label someone for the rest of their life as like you are this person and this is who you're going to be for the rest of your life. Instead, this is a framework rooted in divine love that sees us as human beings who have faults and flaws, and that as human beings who are afforded the opportunity to judge someone, we are asked to see the other person with love and see that we should forgive them, or like at least find excuses in our implementation of justice. So it's away from just American justice, which like creates labels and divisions and hatred, whereas this is more about bringing us together and seeing that you as the person judging someone has a responsibility in the end of the day, and you yourself will be judged by the divine.
Yeah, right. I mean, look at this election cycle. It's insane. Not like who won and who didn't win. You might think that's insane. I didn't think it, I mean, whatever. But like people in the aftermath of it, right? Like you got Democrats who are all over social media talking about how they're looking forward to like Gaza being turned into a parking lot because Arabs and Muslims didn't vote for Harris and that's why she lost. Or they're like calling like ICE on their neighbors who are undocumented, right? Because they're upset so many Latinos like voted for Donald Trump. Do you know what I mean? But the quick mode to enact like retribution in that way is contrary to like what it is that Abir is saying, at least what I take from her. Do you see what I mean? A mode that says like, let's take a step back and actually think about what we're about to do before we do it. And I demonstrate authority by keeping you in your place and putting you in your place. And like, I punish and I punish and I punish without any sense of accountability. Do you know? And a mode of like what exactly? You're so disenchanted with whatever like dream you think you're buying into of how like American democracy functions, and your own sense of arrogances are not willing to acknowledge what you contribute to systems that then set you up in this way, and you don't know how to deal with like the emotions of something, so you seek to ruin somebody else's life, not caring like what happens, right? How do we deal with certain things? Like, I have students who ask me questions. How does my father fast in Ramadan? I'm like, what do you mean? It's like, my dad's lived in solitary confinement for decades. He doesn't even know when the sun is up and down because of how they treat him. The implementation of separation of families, right? Like, there's people you pray Jummah with here who are refugees, who are the children of refugees. They have family members they haven't seen because of mass deportations that take place. How do those things happen? That's why you can't look at Islamic law the way you see law and order, quote unquote, being implemented in most like societal settings, including like some Muslim states, right? Because it doesn't necessarily like take on the undertones. There's more had punishments likely carried out over the last century of Islam than there were in the first 13 centuries of Islam altogether. You have the implementation through reductive understandings of a beautiful legal tradition that we have that seeks to fulfill a certain objective and purpose. That's why I'm not sitting here saying to you, and here's this verse about zina, and here's this. You have to feel empowerment through the religion by knowing how it actually functions and what it's about. And then it removes like burdensome aspects to ritual and practice, because you're attaching it to a sense of a God that you are trying to please, that you also know has like a love for you. And his mercy is taking precedent over his anger. Like, why not then try to implement that as best as you can, even in these situations? Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? So spend some time with the article. Any other thoughts like of what you discussed, what came up for people? Yeah.
I thought about two things. The first, like, the like hadith, I guess, about like 40 excuses. Like when you hear something about someone, like, or if someone like annoys you, you have to make 40 excuses, and then that's just like an arbitrary number. Like when you get to 40, you keep going and onward. And then number two, I thought about like when we're like in front of God on the day of judgment, and He's deciding whether or not we go to heaven or hell. Like ultimately, it's not our sins; it's God's mercy. And so, like, we're, living beings. I think we have, like, our deeds and things are going to define us both. Like, God's mercy is so great. And just, like, the idea of mercy kind of over and over and showing each other mercy. So I think those two things is kind of what I thought about in the examples that they showed in the article about just, like, even if someone is throwing up red wine, like, what if they drink it on accident? Like, what if they didn't know, or just constantly making excuses for people.
Yeah, right. And it's like, the thing that people see on the internet all the time, the sheikh who's answering fatwas and someone calls in and is like, sheikh, if I'm fasting and I slipped and like the shawarma fell in my mouth and this and that, whatever. Do you know what I mean? Right? But like, what are they trying to do here? Are they trying to actually like have like the point of Islam is not to cut off people's hands. Like, that's not the point of Islam. Do you know? Some other things I'm just going to throw out there in instance of time, because we're not going to go till 9 o'clock today. Right? You cannot learn this through a YouTube video that's 15 minutes long. You have to get to a place at this juncture in your relationship with Allah that you actually learn religion, and it's a source of education that you take it from, and not a source of entertainment. Do you know? We have our own version of concerts. I'm not knocking it. You can take a lot from going to places where there's 10, 20, 30,000 people. Do you know what I mean? But it's not a metric of success or achievement, the number of people who show up to something. Do you know? The hyper-legalization of our religious tradition and the absence of understanding its foundational mechanisms then get us to a place where people who are Muslim take hadith reductively and start to do all kinds of stuff that don't make any sense. And we want to be in a place where like we learn our religion through reading about it in detail, as well as reading things that match where we are in our intellectual capacity today. You have gone beyond a point where you just pick up a book that is a list of like do's and don'ts on how to pray. Some of us might be revisiting it or learning it the first time, but that's not like how pedagogically you also expose yourself in an absolute sense. You sit, you think, you reflect, you look at like what is historical evidence of the implementations of things. So that one doesn't create chaos inwardly. Why would the Prophet say this? Like, you're not answering it like rhetorically. You're actually like, where does this come from? How do I understand it contextually, the grammar of it, like what it is that it applies itself to? Do you see? And you start to also think, like, when I'm taking knowledge from someone, whether I see them as a teacher or a professor, right? Someone I'm taking information from, someone I'm taking like life advice from, and how it is that I govern my affairs. You take a lot of information from people. You're probably not gonna go email Jonathan Brown and ask him, like, should I marry this person or not because you read this article? Do you know? But that's not why he's writing it. Do you see what I mean? But you start to think, like, why do I listen to the people I listen to? I've spent hours of time downloading and digesting what I downloaded of videos and sound bites, but what did it offer to me in terms of insight and growth in the different dimensions of Islam and my religion at the juncture that I'm in right now? Do you know? And then you catch up inwardly to your capacity. Do you see what I mean? That isn't like, I'm gonna be the one like doing ijtihad and making legal rulings, but like all of us can follow what he's saying. Do you get what I mean? And then we can convene and read together. You might not want, I don't know if you're enjoying this conversation or not, do you know? But say you are, then why can't you get people in your house and read something together and like kind of distill it? And when you have a question, just write the question down. And then you go and you ask somebody the question. It's as simple as that. Do you know? And there's a difference between going and asking somebody the question versus Googling the question. Because 9 out of 10 hits that you're gonna get are gonna be made by people who create sites that not even overtly but subtly make you hate your religion. And if you don't think there's people right now that are flooding all kinds of stuff so that most of what you get exposed to, like, takes advantage of low literacy and enhances doubt, like, yeah, they're doing it, do you know? So you just gotta be like smarter about it and how you approach it. We're gonna go through the rest of this article next week. It's gonna talk about like what happens if the HUD is not implemented. It's gonna talk about historical instances of the hudud. Is going to talk about like a couple of other things as well. Another recommendation I would have when you read a book or you read an article, short or long, academic or fiction, not whatever, right? If there's footnotes, there's endnotes, like read those things. It offers an insight that is for the person who's thirsty for information. The goal is not to get done with the article. Do you know what I mean? This is why part of the adab of reading Quran is that you don't look to see how many pages are left in the juz. You don't look to see how much is, like you're not trying to end the exercise. You want to keep reading, right? Sayyid ibn Musayyib, rahimahullah, he says, like, I know when my du'as are being answered because my arms are riddled with goosebumps, the tears are flowing from my eyes, but I want to keep praying and keep praying and keep praying. You know, I'm not trying to stop making the dua. I want to keep making the dua. My heart is in it, right? The idea isn't to have achievement that says, I read the book. Who cares if you read a book if you don't do anything with what you read from it? And if you don't, like, none of it sticks or informs behavior. Do you see what I mean? That's not knowledge, right? Knowledge is not that. Especially knowledge that's laden with like wisdom and hikmah that then seeks to implement on what I know, you know? So go read the footnotes Even if you don't know what it is that he's talking about, you don't know the books that he's citing, it's totally fine. You start to familiarize yourself with like terminology, language. Do you know what I mean? Right? I'm not saying this to be mean, right? But to illustrate a point. How many words did you mispronounce when we were reading today? 5, right? Amazing. You could learn 5 new words today. Do you see? And there's other people who don't know words, right? Did you stumble over some of the Arabic, right? It's not embarrassing. That's totally fine. Love where you are so you can get to be where you could potentially be. But even if the endeavor just had you learn new words, there's benefit in that. And then you can deepen in your vocab and understand things through like new prisms, because that's what language does. Do you know? What are you reading in like too long don't read abridged version of something that has just like the same words repeated again and again and again? If you've read the word Trump and Harris like 1,000 times in the last week, and you've read the name of Allah like a handful of times, what are you reading? Do you know? And why? So read the footnotes, like read the endnotes, familiarize yourself with words, write down words that you say, I don't know this word, I don't know how to pronounce this word, right? And that's okay. Then I take the steps to say, I'm gonna add this. And like, don't use words that don't sound like normal conversation. That's not about being intelligent, right? That's just like you're forcing yourself too much. Do you see what I mean? But all of this comes from just like reading and engaging in something that isn't just a regurgitation of things that we already know that zina is haram. We know that murder is haram. We know that treason in many communities is something that is like a problematic interaction. That's what this hadith is talking about, right? At those levels. We want to use the opportunity to like deepen in it a little bit more and then think and reflect so we're getting closer to not just the law, but we're getting closer to the lawmaker, the lawgiver, the source of all of this, right? Does that make sense? Okay, let's take a pause here. On Friday, Ustad Amjad Tarsan is going to be here again for Jum'ah, and I think he's going to give a halaqah that evening as well. I don't know what other events we have going on this week. I heard the stuff we did last week went really well. Like people enjoyed the professionals event, the paint and sip, and the convert brunch. Did that go well also? You did? It's good because it was at your house and you were running it. So I hope it went well. Yeah, great. MashaAllah. Right? Yeah. It was cute? Great. That's what we're striving for here. We want to do things that are cute. That's exactly what I'm hoping people will think about when they think about what we do at the Islamic Center. Amazing. I'm going to go home and cry a little bit, but that's okay. Yeah. Do people know, like, what? I should know the answer to this question. I don't know what else is happening this week. Is there other stuff happening this week that people know what's happening? Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, speaking of the Converse group, on Thursday, the 14th, actually for those who are not familiar, the group is called Conversation, and the main idea is to serve the needs of the converts, people who are exploring Islam, and also like the family members. So one of those needs that was recognized is holiday seasons come, and this might be a group of people who didn't grow up with experiences of like or memories of like Eid, but other types of holidays that are kind of like that season is coming soon. So navigating these can bring like beautiful memories or like tricky scenarios on how to navigate. So what we're going to be doing on Thursday at the other side of the building, room 905, we're going to have number one food, food, and we're going to have a session on like how just to talk and figure out how to navigate the upcoming holiday season. So we can
know any converts, people who fit in this like group, people who are in Islam, or family members of converts, let them know. I see a few people here.
I'm gonna be there.
Oh, okay. Amazing. So yeah, that's happening on Thursday, 6 to 9. Yeah, room 905.
Alhamdulillah. Right? And you take the hadith that we're looking at right now, and you think about like mercy, compassion that's exerted in the prism of like people who are transgressing against like Allah's rights. Do you know? What kind of mercy and compassion then should you have for somebody who's the only Muslim in their family, trying to figure out how to make sense of things like holidays and relating to people? Do you know? And how you have on a very human level a sense of like, then what does that mean when I'm like with my family on the day of Eid, like where's this other person gonna be? Or in the notions of how I talk, you don't have to make what's impermissible permissible or permissible impermissible, but you can extrapolate from hadith a lot of other things also, other than what's most apparent. Do you see what I mean? Okay. We prayed Isha, a lot of us, before the halakha started. I think other people prayed right when it came in as well. Is anybody going to still pray Isha that hasn't made Isha? You can make a Jama'at together. Yeah, great. So if there's people who didn't pray, maybe like in the next 10 minutes, they'll make another Jama'ah. If you want to just put your chairs against the wall. If somebody could take those last 2 drinks that these guys brought, that would be great. Also, we'll see everyone next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.